Anyone know anything about biopolitics? It, the word comes from biopower, and they're rather new for a political theory. It was thought up by the French thinker Michel Foucault in the mid 20th century or so, and developed by European philosophers like Giorgio Agamben. To understand biopower, you need to understand three major concepts: Homo sartre, the state of exception, and sovereignty. These are the people that developed the theory and came up with even more extensions to it. First key concept is Homo sartre. It means sacred man in Latin, and it's taken from a concept in Roman law. It notes that a person marked as an exile can be tortured or killed without repercussions. And it sounds like a barbaric punishment, something that you wouldn't even be able to visualize happening to you in a modern democracy like the United States, but that's because you're not supposed to. To illustrate this, look at your average prison. Though you're protected by the law and the constitution in the states, the minute your butt lands into prisons, many of your rights and laws that usually protect you suddenly disappear. And within those prisons, prisoners are subjected to violence, assaults, murder, and so on. When and only when these crimes are found out do the guards that commit these crimes get punishments, and those punishments are often minor. That is the power, or really the lack of power of Homo sartre, being stripped of their protections and dehumanized until they're really defenseless and nothing more than something that could be used or killed. It is this chaotic exclusion that other people can feel included within a community. And the prison example illustrates another concept, the state of exception. It's a place where people become Homo sartre, where law is suspended, yet some other laws are enforced at the same time. It sounds weird. How is that possible, being enforced while suspended? In biopolitical discussions, I usually refer to the Constitution since it is a somewhat okay example of this. The 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Which, in other words, you are protected from becoming a slave except as punishment for a crime. And though it might be a little extreme, America said that slavery is legal with that amendment, and at the same minute, it came up with another solution. Let's throw people it wants to be more productive into prisons to turn them into Homo sartre. And though slavery is considered much harsher, especially back then, most people in prison do not do labor like cotton picking. That's true, but that's not the point of what the sovereign wants. It aims for productivity. Interpreted slavery as a condition for exhausting labor and restricted freedom. Removal of rights really only proves the point. People becoming Homo sartre in state of exception leads to harassment from guards, horrible prison conditions, deportations, and you can count the rest. The state abuses the state of exception for more notorious, yet far more secretive punishments than slavery in the 19th century. And the 13th Amendment helps illustrate the final point, sovereignty. Sovereignty can be described as something that has the power over the state of exception. It can be seen in the government, political leaders, or even the communities. But ultimately, it's not physical. It's not something you can just overthrow the leader and it's gone. Really, it's just a concept of power, a metaphysical machine of sorts that only works when inputs are right. Sovereignty exerts its power under the guise of justice, which are through things like law, which always requires justice to be enforced. In other words, it always requires violence to be enforced. It dodges reforms that try to change its will, like you could look at the Jim Crow laws that promoted racial segregation in response to the 14th Amendment that allowed everyone to be recognized as equal. Sovereignty ultimately uses the state of exception and Homo sartre within as an excuse to commit its crimes. In fact, wherever and whenever there is a state of emergency, it becomes an excuse to create even more Homo sartre. Look at 9/11. When it happened, the state of emergency was declared. Mass hate crimes, many of them went unpunished. Investigation and surveillance programs could be done on anyone that looked Middle Eastern. War and terror followed, which is when the sovereign decided that certain Middle Eastern countries' populations are now Homo sartre. And so we went to war and we killed them without even considering how many ethical windows we broke. Innocent Yemeni children were bombed, cities were turned into dust. And if you want to look at productivity at home, you could simply look at how we focus on our jobs. People that are in debt are marked as unproductive. They're thrown into prisons. Recent stimulus checks have barely been enough to keep many working class families alive, and student debt crushes countless numbers of those that leave college. And yet, the United States has more than enough money to keep their prisoners, which make up 25% of the world's imprisoned population, alive. It subtly throws people into the state of exception so they can be dehumanized and killed. And with each passing act, it only becomes more and more secretive. You have movements like BLM that are cracked down, communities that are attacked without any actual, what you could say, even retribution, and so on. When something obtains power over a population, it seeks to control it in every way it can, identifying those that pose a risk to the machine, as well as the unproductive population, and controls said people. And it seems like sovereignty is a really powerful force that really can't be stopped. It legitimizes itself in our heads through propaganda as children and in our education, and promises future redemption with all these messianic reforms. But in the end, it seems like we're all in this bloody loop. But in a world of democracy, freedom, we shouldn't be seeing ourselves as the last people that could have genocide committed on. Instead, we should talk. Sovereignty is simply waiting to turn democracies into authoritarian regimes, seizing chances whenever it can to exclude a group from a community, declare them homo sartre. And so we must talk. Discussions of biopower are key for both adults like Mr. Vasily and students like us to understand the proliferation of its myths and of sovereign legitimacy. And we risk becoming a victim with each single minute. You could see it outside, like, for example, in the case of Breonna Taylor's, where one day you could just be sleeping in your bed and the next you could have violence committed on for absolutely too harsh of a reason, so on. You could be hit with Trump's Muslim ban that he enacted a long time with his executive order that suddenly put you into a risk of becoming a homo sartre. So really, the only thing that we can talk about how the sovereign is legitimate and refuse the need for exclusion in our communities. Speak up as political activists about how these kind of moves that it makes, slavery in prison, so on, are really uncomparable to the past, is really just a blatant disregard for the sovereign's power and its potential. Only then can we really break away from sovereign logic from the inside out and form communities away from logic to reconstruct our existence and ethics.